Systematic approach. That's one word that's common between the past speaker, which is Dr. Rathgen, and our next speaker, who I'd like to introduce shortly. He is a graduate of a Bachelor of Science at the Iowa State University, and he took up agricultural business. Then he took up DVM, or Doctor of Veterinary Medicine, also at the same university. Then he wasn't satisfied there. He still took a Master of Science in Swine Production Medicine at the University of Minnesota. When I asked him earlier, how would you like to be described in terms of your professional experience? It is very broad. Let me just, and I hope I give justice, is that he has had numerous roles with Boehringer Ingelheim. Currently, he's the head of the technical team for key accounts in China. Without further ado, let me give you Dr. R Kolb.
Thank you very much, Carlo, for the gracious introduction. Thank you also, all of you, for being here today. And thank you for putting up with the headphones and translation. It's much better that way than having me trying to do anything in a language other than English. If you have questions, remember these little yellow cards, and I have some questions of my own on there. So write those down. I think what I'll do will fit beautifully with what Dr. Rathgen just said. He gave you the foundational basics of PRRS control, and I'm going to walk through a summary of 4 large-scale long-term projects. And by long-term, I mean anywhere from 36 months all the way up to 4.5 years. The shortest one, I think, was 24, actually. 24 months to 4.5 years of time looking at PRRS control. So right from the beginning, you will notice that we need to be patient with PRRS control. And throughout this presentation, I'll contrast it with some things that I have seen in my first 6 months here, some applications where things may be a little different or things may be very much the same. All of the information I talk about in even more detail with some production numbers from this customer are available online. In this presentation, most of the numbers are just going to be like percentage changes just to protect their confidentiality, but they themselves have put out those numbers at that website, and we'll see that again at the end. So you just saw this, but I think it's extremely important to go over it again. The 5-step process. First step, identify your desired goals for your farm, and that will vary. A breeding farm with some of the new regulations in China that hopefully will be effective by 2020. Breeding farms have to be free of certain diseases. Jeski's, high-path PRRS is on that list. So their goals are going to be different than a commercial farm that simply wants to raise pigs and make money. Step 2, determine the current status of your farm. How is PRRS living within your operation? Every farm will be slightly different. There may be different things that you need to do or to think about. So what's your current status of the virus? Step 3, understand the current constraints of the farm. What can the farm do? We'll talk in these 4 cases that they were each different. Some of the tools we applied were modified from system to system because of their constraints. And a classic one people asked about this morning, and I think they'll ask about it again this afternoon, is herd closure time and introducing gilts in a load, close, homogenize. That's a classic place for farms to have constraints. Step 4, we develop our options for solutions, and those will vary a little bit, and you'll see in these systems, same company, 4 different flows, 4 slightly different programs. And step 5, most importantly, implement and monitor what you're doing to see if it's successful. If there's a problem, change. If you are being successful, continue. So why systematic control with this system? Well, first, they were extremely frustrated They had tried multiple different approaches, different systems, different times. They would think for a month or two life was great, and then they would collapse and fall backwards again. So their current status, or step 2, when we began these projects, was always unstable. And they'd even attempted to use the live virus present on the farm, or one of them, to try to control the disease by generating immunity with that. And that had failed repeatedly. They wanted to develop a successful PRRS control program that they could leverage over time. So before we started this program, we thought about what our goals were in step 1. And we wanted this program to be internally driven. In the English term, they wanted the farmers to own it. They wanted them to drive this process, them to want to control the virus. If they didn't, they weren't going to do the things they needed to do to change. So a clearly defined goal, control of the virus, not elimination. These are commercial farms. They wanted to control the disease. They weren't trying to sell negative breeding stock. It had to be sustainable over time and focus on reducing virus in the growing and finishing population. Most importantly, for financial viability of the projects. We heard earlier about 70% or so of the cost of PRRS virus in a pig farm happens in that growing and finishing pig. Feed cost, mortality, etc. So it had to be financially successful. They had to be able to make money because that's their business. And we also wanted to reduce the amount of field virus that would come from these growing and finishing pigs and blow back into the sow farms. And you'll see where sometimes we were very successful and other times we were not. And step 4, the plan itself had to be simple enough that they could implement it. If it was successful, that they could repeat it down the road. So in the first 6 months I've been here, I think some of the applications or things that would contrast with pigs in North America, PH mentioned, Dr. Rathgen mentioned biosecurity, and some very basic things in biosecurity that can be improved, like this idea of clean side, dirty side. You go to multiple farms and multiple systems, and these are breeder farms, top of the chain, and you walk into the office, and you're still dirty. You've been outside, there are animal traffic on the road, etc., and you're standing there before you take your shower, and you're given your clean clothes and boots. And now you're carrying those into the shower, cross-contaminating them before you're ever in the farm. Easily enough to just think about this concept. Clean side, dirty side. You come in this case, in this kind of a system, take your shoes off, then step over, a Danish type entry. Keeping biosecurity functional. Little changes that can make a big difference. Batch flow of pigs applied throughout the farm, and that really just means all out. It could be a batch flow out of a farrowing room, so the whole farrowing room leaves, so you can successfully clean it, disinfect it, and dry it. It might also be batch flow of gilts coming into the farm. So we'll talk about the idea maybe every 3 months, I batch in multiple ages of gilts and do a little mini load, close, and homogenize every 3 months with my quarterly mass vaccination. Simple ideas you can do. And knowing the status of our incoming animals, most of them here will be positive in our projects. Some of them are positive as well, and we'll talk about the implications. Do some little things well again. This poor fellow in the top picture with the outdoor pigs and the birds, he's stuck. He can't keep birds out of his farm. That's a cost of doing business that way. This is not a farm in China, but I'm using it to represent one. I didn't take a picture of it because I didn't want to bring my camera in. But this farm's done a nice job getting biosecurity all ready to go until there's a hole in the bird netting. So when fall comes and the birds need food and TGE or PED or circulating, those animals have a straight shot into the farm. I happen to be at a breeder level farm here that was brand new, beautifully done. The netting was great, but all along the walkway, about every 10 meters, there was a drain to hose down the walkway that was about that big, ground level, and wide open. So birds, rats, mice, anything around the farm had straight shot into the farm. And all of this other stuff looked great, but they forgot a tiny little thing that can make a big difference. Wash trucks well. We've learned that in North America with PED. And certainly utilize your strengths. In North America, because of costs, etc., we try to replace a lot of things with fancy technology. You've got good people. Utilize those good people. Train them well what to do, and then validate that they're doing it. Utilize your strengths. So back to the case. The materials and methods of these interventions, and really it was interventions, not just vaccination. So if we remember back to step one again, these 4 projects all had the same goal and the same characteristics. In this case, these 4 flows wanted to move from multi-PRRS, that is having all ages of sows on one sow farm. They wanted to move from that to having farms that had gilts and multiplication sows only, and other farms that just had P2 and older commercial sows. So a shift from multi-PRRS to parity segregation. And they wanted to do that without having a dramatic PRRS explosion. Thinking about step 4, the plan, they did a load, close, and homogenize, or LCH. You heard that term this morning, to help those unstable sow farms. And you'll see we documented they were unstable. We loaded them with multiple ages of replacement gilts at one time, closed them, and then used Engelvac PRRS MLV to homogenize immunity. Now those closures ranged in time because, back to step 3, their constraints were different. System A could only close for 147 days. They didn't have capacity. System B closed for 210 days. C and D were around that 200 days also. So not everything is as perfect and organized as the textbook might say. That's real life. That's the constraints of the farm. We had to deal with those. We mass vaccinated in step 4 all of the sows and all of the growing gilts that were on the farm. So we loaded them in, closed the door, mass vaccinated every animal on that farm twice, 4 weeks apart. You see it there. And that was early in the closure, and we allowed the rest of that time for the virus to stop circulating, for immunity to start in the pigs, and for the virus circulation to decrease. System B tweaked things a little bit. They mass vaccinated growing pigs less than 3 kilometers from a sow farm. I would look back at this and say, this is one thing I would change. There were some growing pigs that were also less than 3 kilometers from a gilt development unit, and we did not mass vaccinate those animals. That was a mistake that I would not make again. I would be much more aggressive in mass vaccinating the growing herd that was within close enough contact to all parts of that breeding herd, not just the sow farms. And in systems C and D, we could not convince the veterinarian in charge of that system to give up on live virus exposure. So they attempted to use homologous live virus exposure in their growing gilts and sows, and that's another thing I would do differently. I would not accept their desire to keep using LVI, and you'll see an example of why that's important. Ongoing-wise, we vaccinated the piglets right around weaning, started and continued, and all of these systems now over 7 years from the very beginning of system A, those piglets are still being vaccinated, the sows are still being mass vaccinated quarterly. PRRS virus is still on these farms, so they're not going to give up on the pressure. If the virus is there, the field virus, you keep vaccinating the pigs and the sows to keep that virus in control. And part of step 5, measuring, training, retraining, looking at multiple different ways to think about controlling PRRS virus on the different farms. Again, it was not just the vaccine. In step 5, we had to have a way to measure the success of our project. So we were doing routine sampling. Again, that's part of step 2, assessing the virus status, and step 5, measuring the success. And we looked at things financially and what they would call key production indicators, or KPIs. And we looked at things virologically or biologically. Sampling ready to wean piglets. That's what RTW means, ready to wean piglets. So those were piglets just before weaning, and piglets that should not have been vaccinated. So any virus we found in them would have come either from the sow or would be because those piglets were being retained. They were being held over on the farm against the rules of the program. And anytime we had clinical signs, we had a preset diagnostic protocol that we wanted them to do. Growing pigs and replacement gilts, we treated the same way. We sampled those pigs at the end of the nursery, so about 5 or 6 weeks after weaning, the last full week before they left. Middle of finishing, again, about another 6 weeks or so into the finisher, we did the same thing with the replacement gilts. And from a production standpoint, we had their KPIs by group of growing pigs or by lot. And here's the description of these 4 flows. System A is the first one that would have begun in 2009, late 2008, early 2009. 30,000 sows on 8 farrowing sites. System B, you'll see a lot more detail because that's the biggest one. We have the most information. That was a 54-month-long project, 70,000 sows from 2010 until just last April of 2014. System C and D were about 2 years apiece. 24,000 sows on 12 farrowing sites, and System D, 22,000 sows on 22 farrowing sites. So you see some differences here already in the systems and the flow. System B, a lot more animals in a fairly confined area and big sow farms. System A, a little bit smaller sow farms. System C and D, pretty traditional 1,000 sow farms in D, for example. So varying size sow farms, and that'll influence some of the results. And we had based this on 2 projects you might have seen described elsewhere, but those projects did not have the load, close, homogenized component trying to do parity seg. They just did load, close, homogenize as part of normal production. So we excluded those because they were different. Application here, thinking about mass vaccination and loading the system. First, do no harm. Use a safe vaccine. We heard some discussion this morning about reversion to virulence of some of the high-path PRRS type vaccines, and certainly using live field virus isn't safe. It's pathogenic, it's virulent. So whatever you do, have a system in place that does no harm. Use a safe, stable vaccine. We know from what Dr. Murtaugh talked about this morning that there is cross-protection. We know that. That's been documented, so be confident in that. And we really have to rely on population vaccination. And what's a little different here in Asia, boars, and working boars on the farm. Places where maybe AI is collected right there within the herd, you have to vaccinate the boar. If you don't, you've just left a subpopulation open. Those boars will shed field virus, and that's not a good thing. And why do we feel good that you can do that? This is from our Chinese OPU, just some very, very recent information, where we had a farm where we had documented boars were shedding field virus in semen. So they were already exposed to a virus. They were not naive, and that's a key distinction. Because the farmer was worried, if I vaccinate my boars, will my semen production go down, my fertility go down, etc. Well, we knew they were already at a very, very high risk because they already had field virus there. So we convinced them, let's vaccinate some pigs with PRRS MLV. We know we can reduce shedding of field virus doing that, but let's measure the impact on the semen. And what you've got here is the weight or volume of semen that was collected in vaccinated before, vaccinated after, control before, control after. You can see that vaccinating those boars had no impact on the output of semen. The motility, same story. no impact. The density, how many sperm cells per ml, numerically looks like it's more, but it's not. That's identical. And here the amount of deformed sperm actually was significantly reduced following vaccination of the boars. So the key take-home, in boars that are already positive, mass vaccinate them. Vaccinate them with the same schedule as the rest of the breeding herd. And the key is make sure they're already positive. To study or to think about the control of circulating field virus in these farms, we're back to the example now. The P1 farms were the most inconsistent, and with PRRS you expect that, and that's a weakness of parity segregation. System A, they were able to completely push field virus out of their gilt development unit, and their P1 farms, as a result, obviously were very, very stable and consistently producing negative pigs right off the bat. B, and we'll look at that in a lot more depth, B had a continuous flow gilt development unit that never got rid of its field virus and therefore kept circulating virus and would occasionally bring virus into the sow farm. A very rare clinical disease, but we could not get the virus to go away. P2 farms were very, very stable, though. That was the neat part. As those animals aged, natural immunity in those animals helped to let them clean up the field virus from the growing gilt stage, and they stayed very stable. We sampled every one of those farms every month, so we had a tremendous number of PCRs looking to see if vaccine virus would cross the placenta and infect little piglets. And we detected vaccine virus in total in less than 1% of the piglets. So even though we mass vaccinated sows that were late gestation, that virus very, very rarely crossed the placenta, and it was safe. So be confident when you do that mass vaccination of animals that have already been vaccinated once. That's the key. Vaccinate them when they're little the first time. After that, mass vaccination is a beautiful thing. It's a safe thing to do. And we established parity segregation in all 4 of these systems without clinical signs. We knew virus was circulating because we were doing this tracking. The vaccine was challenged by field virus, but the sows were protected, and very rare clinical signs at all. Now, before you roll over and get concerned, this is a very complicated chart, but if we think about the colors, it actually makes it much simpler. The red boxes on here are where we found a PRRS field virus. So that tells you already we were taking samples of some kind, serum or oral fluids, doing a PCR, and then sequencing it to know what kind of virus we had. The yellow box is Engelvac PRRS MLV only, and a blue box is when they're mixed together, when we find both types of virus. So you can see this set of farms are the multiplication and the P1 or gilt farms. This column is the month of the project, and this is at the very beginning, the project day, and the results in the sow farms, and the results in their offspring. So we can see the flow from going from your left to your right of animals. And what we see when we started the project, it's unstable. Almost every farm, with this one exception, at the beginning of the project, somebody always had a virus positive. The one yellow box here that says 0 of 24, we couldn't sequence that successfully. So a lot of field virus at the beginning. You do see a couple yellow boxes with your first mass vaccination. And from there on out, in this flow, no virus transmission from sow to the piglets, and no evidence of piglets being held back. You do see in these farms that had gilts, though, a lot of this type 1 or EU-like virus continuing to circulate without clinical disease. That's the important part to note. Downstream flow, if they're coming in positive from here, they're probably going to be field virus positive here. But vaccine had a great impact on performance. Mortality in the nurseries, for example, when this project ended, mortality was 0.5%. Spectacular nursery performance. And you can see a lot of vaccine virus, either blue mixed with field virus or even yellow by itself. In the nursery phase, we expected that. It was a good thing to find the virus in those columns with nursery pigs because we gave it to them. We were vaccinating the pigs with a live virus, so we expected to find it. If we had not found it, that would have been a signal that people were not vaccinating pigs. You can see as the project goes along, there's more and more yellow, less blue and red. Even with continuous flow sites, we were able to just keep pushing the amount of virus down. We didn't make it go away. We just had the goal of pushing it down. Older sows, much more stable. You can see occasionally there's a spot here and there where you see a little bit of virus that still is either carried through with gilts or has blown in from a finisher close by, but a much different picture. In the growing pigs, the same idea of more and more vaccine virus pushing out the field virus, so displacing it, we would say. Reproductively, I mentioned a couple of times that we had tremendous benefit in reproductive performance. In these 4 systems, so the 62 sow farms, over a total of number of months, in those 62 sow farms, there were only 5 farms that had any abortions due to PRRS at any point in time in their projects. System B, for example, had a baseline of 4 or 5 farms breaking every year. That 25% annual rate, that was reduced to less than 6%. Virus is still there. Here's our developing gilt sampling, and you can see a lot of virus circulation in those gilts, and they bring that virus into the sow farms, and you can see over time there's virus detection in the sow farms, but there's no clinical signs. And in fact, in System B, there were only 3 sow farms that broke. They broke within about, I can see the total here, about 200 abortions total in 15,000 sows. That was the only outbreak in that system from 2010 until today. 5 years with 3 farms that have broke 1 time. So tremendous control of the field virus. Total in all of these farms, abortions due to PRRS, about 375 total, or 0.25% of the inventory. And I tried to look at this in terms of months of healthy sow farms. So if you take these 62 farms and count up all of the months those farms were in a project, we had 1,482 months where farms were in the project. And only 7 of those months did we have reproductive disease due to PRRS. So we had great control of the virus. And about half of the abortions we saw were due to an intentional exposure. The system that wanted to keep using live virus could not contain it. All right. So the reproductive performance I mentioned, System B started their project in January of 2010. 3 of those 16 farms had an outbreak in 2011, about 200 abortions. Since that time, there have been no outbreaks in 4 years. And in talking with them, or the U.S. account team that works with them a couple of weeks ago, they really wanted to emphasize 4 years without any reproductive disease in that system. So they are extremely happy. But they're still mass vaccinating sows 4 times a year, and they're still vaccinating all their pigs. And the industry as a whole has seen that same kind of a trend. This is back to the Swine Health Monitoring Project that Dr. Murtaugh mentioned this morning. Over time, as more and more people have taken up vaccination of pigs, that's the orange area, you can see a commensurate, kind of from the baseline amount of PRRS that the industry as a whole is seeing reproductive outbreaks due to PRRS decline as well. So vaccinating pigs, we think, is having a regional effect for other people as well, not just for these systems. It makes us feel at least like there's other evidence that looks the same. In the growing pigs, we had, unfortunately, in some places, continuous flow gilt sites and field virus positive gilts coming into the herd. That made it hard for us to meet one of our goals, which was to shrink the dendrogram, or in other words, eliminate some virus families entirely. In system A, negative gilts, we did do that. We took some virus families and completely eliminated that. We'll go over system B, the results there. We documented that MLV can kick the field virus out, even in continuous flow nursery sites. But it's not just the vaccine, it's teaching people, change your boots. You gotta change boots and coveralls from going from young pigs to old pigs. You don't go backwards. You do these other biosecurity things that help, and we were able to move virus out of there. When we found MLV together with a field virus or by itself, we did not see any lesions. It made us feel good again that it was safe, and we impacted the prevalence and quantity of virus as well as the production. Application here. Some places don't have access yet to PCR testing. We're working on that in our HMC, and China will be coming available next year. But use the ELISA test if that's all you got, but use it smartly. The groups here have been trained on how to use a box and whisker plot tool to analyze antibodies. Use it smartly. But there's other things you can do that don't require a lab. Look at things like feed delivered. Pigs that aren't healthy don't eat, so not as much feed gets utilized. Just count the bags. If you've got feed coming into your farm on a truck in bags, keep track of the bags you use and count them. Count the number of treated or dead pigs. This is a typical barn chart from a North American style system where each week they write down the number of, or each day, they write down the number of pigs treated and the number of pigs dead. It's very easy to count dead pigs. Put them on the chart and write it down. It's a great indicator of health. And it's real time. It's what's happening right now. Do cough scoring. It's another tool. Just go into the barn for a certain amount of time and listen and count the number of coughs. It's a great tool to measure respiratory health that doesn't need a lab, doesn't need submission of anything. Or, enteric health, for example, count the number of pens that have scours. And we'll show you a neat little tool at the end that you can use to analyze these. Back to the case. One of our goals was reducing the amount of virus present. That's the virus part. The other goal was production numbers. So we developed a tool or a system of measuring the amount of virus distance. So if it was 3% or greater heterology, we considered it to be a different virus. So that way we could put virus in different families. And we used a nomenclature that was well-defined, the date, the case, et cetera, to track those and put them into a homology table. And we discovered on these systems we had a large range of virus types. We had the North American version of type 1 viruses that were quite a bit heterologous, and we had multiple different families of type 2 or North American viruses with those RFLP cut patterns. So lots of viral heterology, yet still great control. So it's back to Dr. Murtaugh's data and others that you really can feel good. Use the vaccine systematically, you'll get good cross protection. And one of our goals was reducing the amount of field virus in half. And this is some proof that, yeah, we did that. This chart is System B again, January of 10, when the first max vaccination and herd closure took place, and following that for the first year of the project. And again, this was a 54-month project, so we had to kind of condense things. We started out with nothing but field virus in this system because they were not vaccinating. And over the course of about 10 months or 300 days, we got to where we could consistently keep the amount of field virus less than half. So that was one of our targets, was to reduce the amount of field virus present. System A, I don't know if you can see it here. I think on the sides you can. System A, the smaller system, took about 6 months instead of 10 months to get to their 50% field virus reduction. So larger systems take more time. That makes sense. We also looked at shrinking the dendrogram, and here my note to myself to tell you is expectations are very important. In System A, we were very excited because we had kicked some viruses completely out. Well, System B, we didn't. But we had that continuous flow gilt developer. But what we did see is this is the first 4 months of the project, and you can see here's a field virus, an EU-like, one of the families. Here's MLV, and here's a bunch of other field virus families. And they had a name based on where they were first isolated, et cetera. In the second 4-month window, you can see now MLV is now the most common virus isolate, and the count's pretty similar. It should be, because we're sampling the same number of farms every time. And now, these field viruses, they're still there, because we have really big finishing sites that are continuous flow as well, but they're being suppressed. And here, towards the end of the first year, the MLV vaccine was far and away the most common virus we were finding and sequencing, and these field viruses were really nicely suppressed. So we were meeting our goal. We were pushing the amount of field virus down. I'm not showing the CT analysis, but the CT values were going up in those samples that were still positive, indicating less virus. So that's the fun science techie side. But what about the production numbers? Well, we selected those parameters that were most likely related to PRRS, but knowing that other things could influence them. In the sow herd, we tracked weaned per litter, which in their business model was their most important. Breeding herd number, abortions per 1,000 sows, so standardize that. Pre-weaning mortality, or born alive per litter. In the growing pig, we looked at growth rate, mortality, and culls as the primary parameters, also feed efficiency and days on feed. What we focused on, these 5, because those are the ones that were most directly PRRS related, that had a nice financial impact. And we looked at some relationships between those things. We used some different tools to do the analyses. And this is comparing pigs born alive using an analysis of means, an ANOM in SPC lingo, versus a more traditional ANOVA, analysis of variance with a Tukey's test to look for significant differences. And you can see in the classical statistical method, baseline was different than phase 1. Phase 2 and 3 were also different. But for me, this is hard because it's a chart full of numbers. So sifting through this, sometimes you can get lost in those. And I like the histograms that Dr. DePietri had earlier because they're pictures. This ANOM uses almost identical math as the ANOVA, but puts it into a picture. And this is the exact same data from here to here. So baseline, born alive, 12 pigs per litter, just over that. Significant improvements through the project. Not just with the vaccine, but with the other things we did as well in pigs born alive. And we could document it statistically, but also with a nice picture. This one looks at nursery average daily gain. I put this up here to show you that A, it works very well for pig growth numbers as well, but also to remind me to tell you the story of this point, the green one in the middle. We had great results, and the system was really happy, and by phase 3, I mentioned earlier, their nursery mortality was 0.5%, so rocking good performance in the nursery. But we started out with a little bit slower growth rate. Boy, they had a great response in the first 18-month phase, and they were really happy and said, let's expand this thing, let's do more. And then something happened in the second period. Can anybody think of what that would be? Had nothing to do with PRRS virus. This was when corn was about $8 or $9 a bushel and soybeans were very expensive, and they decided that it was much cheaper to go to wheat instead of corn. And they made a beautiful pellet, looked really, really nice with the wheat. The only problem was the pigs didn't want to eat it. So less feed intake, less gain. Corn price goes down, corn price goes down, they put it back in the ration. They like to eat it, and bam, intake comes back, growth rate comes back. And the message there is monitor what's going on the farm, because it's not all PRRS. Other stuff can happen too. These are the percentage changes, and for some of you in the back, it might be easier just to use the table in the program. And these are the percentage improvements in performance. Again, you can see in the video where they share their actual numbers with you. But with one exception here, where we made one of our other big mistakes. We failed to completely empty a nursery and a nursery depot. Otherwise, all of those improvements in performance were statistically significant. So nice improvements in growth rate, nice reductions in mortality across a number of different systems, 5 different states over the course of a number of different years. And those expectations, or those numbers we saw, came very, very close to some other numbers looking at PRRS vaccination as well. Dr. Gillespie mentioned this study this morning. We had finishing barns that were concurrently housed on the same finishing site, so they were very well controlled by site, and we saw a nice 1% reduction in mortality and a nice improvement in average daily gain, both of those statistically significant. About the same order of magnitude. And then an internal study with the same customer looking at various ways to put PRRS vaccine into the pig compared to not PRRS vaccine. And in a challenge study with about 300 pigs per group, again, significant or a trend toward significant improvements in performance. So it just makes you feel good that both in the before and after projects, but also in some controlled studies, that the improvements you were seeing were logical. They made sense. Back to things we can do here. I talked earlier about counting feed bags, counting dead pigs. There's a wonderful tool. You saw some charts from a program called Minitab. That's a great statistical program to use, but you got to have the data to put into a computer. It's got to be validated, etc. The simple application is something that was developed all the way back in the 1920s by Schuhart. And it's just this is an XMR chart. It's a simple chart that you can do in the barn with a pencil and paper. And it hits the variation question that Dr. DePietri mentioned this morning. The top is the average, and the bottom chart looks at the variability from group to group. This can be done with a pencil and a paper. Doesn't have to be fancy. So feed bags used per week in phase. You can do those kind of things straightforward. And Dr. Deming here, who was kind of I guess maybe the commercializing father of SPC, said understanding normal versus abnormal variation again. And we did not talk in advance of our presentations that variation would be an important theme, but measuring that variation really is important. So you act on real differences. If you can get it, it's only in English, but this is a great little 70 or 80 page book to read. It really explains the math very basically, shows you how to do it by hand, and anybody can do it. So the lessons learned in our last 4 minutes, we had a nice improvement in before and after financial numbers. Vaccine works. Field virus was there. We know it was exposing animals, but vaccine protected them. The interventions that we did, not just the vaccine, but training on flow, on biosecurity, decreased the proportion of wild-type virus that was there, and those samples that were positive, their CT values went up. So there was less of the virus in the positives. And using MLV vaccine in pregnant sows was safe. We very rarely found it. No evidence that it was regularly crossing the placenta. We had a good lesson about expectations. The bigger a system, the longer time it's going to take to control PRRS. And I would say to anybody here, no matter how big your farm is, give Boehringer a year. It'll take us a year to have a good PRRS control in your system. But if you're willing to commit to that, we can help put together that program, vaccine and other steps, using that 5-step process that can help you reduce the amount of virus you have to. We developed a process to analyze these sequences. That may not be as important here for now, but it will be soon. And we utilized some other tools as well, BioPortal and ANOM and those things. We used PadRap because we were very close to Iowa State University. If you go to the PRRS 5-step website, there's a simpler online tool that you can use right here, right now, to do the same thing, to look at your risk on your farms. And we looked at risk versus diagnostic results, and by golly, they oftentimes lined up. If you reduce risk, you can reduce the amount of virus that you've got circulating. We got creative with how we tried to measure things like cleaning and disinfection to help the farm. And probably the most fun for the guys on the farms was We really looked at some of their own personal questions. We helped them do their jobs better and to document it to their bosses. So they really enjoyed that. And the contrast here, yes, we do have greater disease pressures in Asia. We've got Ajewski's disease, we've got foot and mouth, we've got classical fine. Yes, we do have those things. But pigs and pig flow and some of these basic statistical tools, they're going to work for you as well. We just have to apply them right and adapt those to the constraints that you have. Vaccinate populations, do the boar and the pregnant female, do everybody, but just make sure you vaccinate them the first time when they're little, and then from a safety standpoint, you're okay. Think about how you can batch pigs into groups and not just growing pigs. Batch and replacement gilts. Bring 3 months of gilts in at a time, mass vaccinate them when you're doing the rest of your herd, as one example. And think about the tools you have and the constraints on your farm and adapt them. And probably the biggest thing is attitude. Just about out of time, I'm going to acknowledge the people because they really made this thing work. Drs. Roger Main and Chris Rademacher, they're both at Iowa State now. Drs. Daryl Tomke, Ed Kluber, Dave Mattson, and Pete Lasley. These were the system-level veterinarians that really helped get their team members fired up. Our field services team, we're putting that same kind of a team together here in Asia. The HMC and Iowa State were spectacular on diagnostics, but most of all, the production staff on the farm. Those people bought in, they did the things we asked them to do, and without them, the program would not have worked. There's that website again, and I think that's in their proceedings as well, where you can get Dr. Rademacher on tape telling you his version of the real story and with the actual numbers if you want those. So thank you very much.